just setting up the computer arrangement over there. Yeah, my name's Victor Leach. I'm a retired radiation health physicist. I've worked for 40 or 50 years in this industry. Most of my work has been in uranium mines, and it's about protecting people, and radiation safety has been at the forefront of all that I've done over those years. And in the last decade, the last 15 years, I've actually got very involved in looking at the non-ionising radiation, that is the radio frequency waves that are being rolled out and being used for communications. Just while we're organising that, I'd just like to I'd like to start off by talking about the current standards that we have, and those standards are delivered by what's called the Internet. If you just go back one, the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation. They're part of the World Health Organisation, and they actually set those standards. Now, the first thing is we decided in the early, about 2.5 years ago, a number of us to actually set up an association, a scientific association, and we realised that we needed to have a number of different types of disciplines involved with us. That's biologists, physicists, endocrinologists, psychologists. We needed a whole range of disciplines to evaluate the science. So we started off looking at how we were going to go about evaluating the science. In the last 15 years, there's been an amount of information in the research literature. So I'll just go back to. You'll need to go to full screen. No, you'll need to go to full screen down here. Yeah, okay, so these guidelines, as I said, the ORSAA organisation set up, and we've got a number of members that have got lots of different scientific disciplines. We also have associate members. These are retired people, usually teachers or nurses, that have actually joined our association as supporters, and they're all volunteers. We're not an advocacy group. We're about the science, and that's what we wanted to do, is to look at the science and look at it free from being linked to any industry, and to look at the science independently. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, next slide. Next slide. So I'll just wait for the next slide. Anyway. So, no, that's, you've got to begin. Hang on, wait, we've got a few technical difficulties here. Can you just go to the beginning? Can you go to the beginning of the presentation? Just. That's right. No, go to the beginning of the presentation. Yeah, do it, Steve. Yeah, sorry, we've just got a bit of a technical problem. I'm actually a bit of an Apple lover. I hate Microsoft because they're always difficult. You need to go. Yeah. Okay, okay, that'll do. Yeah, we'll move on from there, Steve. Now, there are many disciplines involved, and as we said, the first thing we decided to do was to set up a database and to categorise all the scientific papers into effect papers, no effect papers, uncertain effect papers. So we decided to go through the process of categorising those papers, and we've put into the database 3,100 papers. Now they're actually accessible on the web. Anybody can go there and actually look and do research and do their own research. Next slide, please. Now, I think this is sort of very instructive, because when you look at this, you can see there's we're looking from outer space, we're looking from satellite, we're looking at large bushfires. And this is very instructive because we're actually seeing a lot of smoke. We can't actually see the fire, but there's a lot of smoke there. So one would believe that possibly there's a fire under there, and I think we all know there is. There was a huge bushfire there in Victoria. And this, I want to keep that in mind as I go through the slides, so you actually get a feel for what I'm on about in terms of the science. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. what we did in our database, we actually put in a whole lot of papers. And you'll notice there there's 663 in vivo papers. Okay, what that means is they're cell studies, okay? They're test tube studies, cell studies, irradiated, we've irradiated the papers, the researchers irradiated the sample, and they've looked for changes in the cell structure. You'll notice there there's 1,033 what they call in vivo studies. Now they're animal studies. They're studies that are actually where you irradiate the animal, and then you do that for a number of weeks, or it could be days, it could be years. And then what you do is you sacrifice the animal and you look for changes in the animal. You look for tumours that have been developed after these animals have been exposed. Most of them are rats and mice, but there are also primates in there. We've also exposed primates to RF radiation. You'll see their provocation studies. Now what they are, those studies are where they put people in a room and switch on an antenna and see whether they feel the radiation. Now that's actually, when you think about it, it's pretty silly. Because, I mean, you can go and have an X-ray and you won't feel the X-ray. If you were exposed, say for example, if you go to the sun and you get exposed to the sun, right, for a number of hours, it won't be until next day that you actually will find that you've got sunburn. Okay, so biological systems aren't linear. They're not linear systems. So when you expose somebody to electromagnetic radiation, radio frequency radiation, or you don't get a direct effect. It happens sometime later. So they're a bit silly. These studies are a bit silly. And then we've got epidemiological studies. Now these are disease studies. These are where we go into the hospitals and we interview people who've got brain tumours, and we develop profiles on those people. And we group them into how many hours they've actually used the telephone for against their ear. So we actually build up a profile of the disease. Now those studies, the problem with those studies is there's lots and lots of confounders in those studies. They're very difficult studies to do. And the biggest study that was done was the interphone study, and that was back in 2000, 2004, which was a very large study. So there's lots of problems in doing these studies, but even when they did these studies, they showed that if a person using a mobile phone glued to their ear for in excess of 50 minutes a day, and they did that for in excess of 5 years, and particularly out to 10 years, the risk factors for them getting a brain cancer was actually significant. It wasn't insignificant. This study, when it was done, the actual results weren't published straight away. It took almost 4 years for those results to be published. And then the media, when it came out in the media, they said, but this, yeah, we didn't detect any brain, there's no relationship, no statistical relationship between brain cancer and these studies. Might go to the next one. The problem with these studies is that we talk about the precautionary approach, and the precautionary approach is actually triggered by two factors. One is the strength of evidence. That is, we're seeing all that smoke, that's the strength of evidence that there might be a bushfire under there. And the other one is the potential cost of doing nothing. And it can be many, many years between discovering that people have got a health problem, and in particular asbestos. In 1898, scientific papers were written that people had chest complaints. They were working in mines where there was asbestos, free asbestos in the air, and they were finding these people had lung conditions. That was 1898. They actually didn't ban it until 101 years later. So there's often a long time between exposure and we actually get around to doing anything. And in particular, the second one there, Dr. John Snow, who was an English physician, he was basically the father of epidemiology, disease studies. And what he did, he plotted the people who were dying in Soho, and he realised they were all centred around as well. And he thought that the water was the problem, that the people were getting sick and dying because of the water. So this was the first epidemiological study, the first disease study. And so what he did, he actually took the pump off the well, so they couldn't drink the water, and all of a sudden he discovered that that people weren't getting sick anymore. So he knew the problem was in the water, the problem was in the water, but it wasn't until 29 years later that we actually knew why. That it was cholebacteria that was actually creating it. So there's often smoking as well. Richard Dole, he, 1952, he wrote up lung cancer versus smoking. He did a survey and found there was a problem, and he gave his talk at the Royal College of Surgeons. But, you know, I was on a plane in 1970, and I can remember that you smoked at the back of a plane. You were still allowed to smoke at the back of the plane. So it took a long time before we actually did something. And next slide, thanks. Anyhow, the people who set these standards or reference levels that people are exposed to, that is occupational standards and non-occupational standards, there are two bodies. One's called ICRP, International Commission on Radiological Protection, and the other one that sets the RS standards is called ICNIRP, International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. Now you probably think that they're similar names, and they're probably related organisations. Wrong. They're completely different organisations. They have nothing much to do with one another. The first organisation looks after X-rays and gamma rays and set standards, but they, when it gets to low dose X-rays and gamma rays, they actually take a precautionary stance, and so they're more like risk managers. So they're very careful at low doses, whereas the people setting the standards for ICNIRP, setting the standards, the Australian standard that it's based on, they actually want certainty. They want to know there's cause and effect. They want to know there's a positive cause and effect before they'll actually take any action. So the precautionary approach doesn't even enter into their philosophy. Next slide, please. Yeah, and as I said there, the ICRP, which is a non-profit organisation established in 1928, they're very careful, and they have concepts as low as reasonably achievable. Those concepts don't, in the RF space, at radiation space, when people are getting exposed to RF radiation, there's no concepts of precaution whatsoever. They've set the levels so high, they actually, they're based on cooking, heating. It's basically a microwave, okay? So the only effects they take into account are heating effects. Any biological effects that happen below that heating level, they basically ignore. But they do say that, that children and the elderly and some chronically ill people might have a lower tolerance to this radiation, but they don't do anything about it. It's basically the precautionary approach they don't adopt. It's basically not even looked at. And this is the, I was talking a little bit about lung cancers. When you do these disease studies, when you look up there, you find 51% of the studies show effect. There's quite a large number of studies that show no, are uncertain, and there's you've got no effect studies. And another organisation within WHO classified RF radiation as a possible carcinogen. Now, when they did that classification, they didn't take into account any of the animal studies. They weren't looked at. They only looked at the disease studies. They only looked at the epidemiology. They completely ignored all the animal studies. And I'll show you, as we'll show later on, that they actually are important. So, as I said, when they did that study, the largest industry study was the Interphone study. 4 years later, they came out and said, there's no link between brain cancer and the use of mobile phones. There's none whatsoever. Well, that's true, but only for people who use a mobile phone for 1 or 2 hours a week. Those people who actually use the mobile phone for in excess of 50 minutes a day, and they continue to do that for 5 years, and in particular the group in 10 years, the risk factors were quite significant. They weren't trivial, and so there was basically a real problem there. These studies are very difficult to do. You've got to find a population who don't use a mobile phone. That's going to be pretty well impossible in the future to do these studies, because there's 9 million people in this world, and there's 9 billion people in this world, and there's 5 billion mobile phones. So it's going to be really difficult to do these sorts of studies in the future. The other thing I'd like to say, and it's quite interesting, they excluded, in that study, they excluded young adults and children. They weren't part of that study. they excluded him. And if you died because you had a brain cancer during the study, they basically weren't counted in the study at all. So there was a lot of fudging of the data, and in particular, one of the things that was really quite interesting when they looked at whether you were a left-handed or a right-handed person. As soon as they did that, and they found the tumour was on the left side or the right side, there was actually the studies which had no effect actually became effect studies, because those tumours followed which side of your ear you actually had the mobile phone up to. So these studies aren't easy to do, and there's lots of flaws. But even with all these flaws, there still came out with risk factors for those people who were considered to be heavy users. Now, a heavy user, as I said, it's more than 50 minutes a day. So if you've got that phone glued to your ear and you continue to do that more than 50 minutes a day, you're moving into another risk regime. Next slide, thanks. A PANSA, you've heard of PANSA, they're the Commonwealth Regulatory Authority. Well, they're not really the regulatory authority, they're a pseudo-regulatory authority. They only issue guidelines. There's a real problem there, and there's no independent, really, organisation as such. But PANSA produced a report in 2014, it came out, and they reviewed the science from the year 2000 to 2012. They looked at all the papers and they reviewed the science. Now these are the test tube studies, these are the cell studies, and you can see that the first column says genotoxic, 16 effect studies. We found 34 because their database, we actually got a copy of their database and actually loaded it in our database and categorised it and had a look to see whether there were, how many effect studies and no effect studies were in there. And we got a completely different result. And if you go down there and you look at gene expressions, the exposure of these cells, they only found 4 studies that had effect and 10 studies that had no effect, and we found 71 in their own database. 1,354 papers they had, and they delivered it to us in a text file, which actually took a long time actually getting in our database and categorising it. We also have Professor Henry Lye's papers, his collection. He's a researcher. He's an emeritus professor, he's one of our advisors. He actually gave us his lifetime collection of papers, and he classified them into effect and no effect studies. And we put his papers in there, but we can actually look at the PANSA group, and you can see there that they were saying that it's 50-50. Up there on the right-hand side there, you said 46-54, and we said, no, it's probably more like 68-30. And that's their own data. Next slide, thanks. And these are the living organisms. These are the rats and mice that get exposed, and you can actually look for the bioeffects. And when you go down, for example, if you look at the first one, they said, oh, we only found 21 papers that showed effect, and 17 no effect, and we found 72 in their own database. So what the hell is going on? This Commonwealth Authority that doing this review of the evidence and presenting it to us, what are they doing? Well, and you can see down there the very last one, oxidative stress, which is a big one, 124 papers. And they didn't even look at that. They discounted the bioeffect of oxidative papers. They just completely didn't bother about it. And we got 124 papers that show effect and 10 no effect. This is in their own database. So what were they doing? Why did they collect this 1,354 papers that they were going to analyse? Why didn't they look at the data, the science? That's what they were supposed to do. Next slide. So, yeah, so the expert reviewer...
Have they been challenged on this at all?
Yes, I'll tell you more about that, yeah, you betcha. Anyway, on top of that, the expert reviewer, he didn't look at the database, he didn't look at all the papers they collected. We did. They didn't bother doing that. He just basically used another review. A health department, UK health department review. He basically looked at that, and he basically just repeated the evidence that the UK Department of Health repeated, and there were real problems with that evidence. And Dr. Sarah Starkey, who's a neurologist in the UK said, look, that review was terrible. It's scientifically inaccurate. The conclusions did not reflect the evidence. You can sort of see that for yourself. And the studies were admitted. Oxidative stress was not given coverage. The fertility effects were ignored. The cognitive effects were ignored. The behavioural effects were ignored. They were all misrepresented. So it appears that TR164, this review that our Commonwealth government was doing, was a terrible review. And we said to them, this is terrible. You know, I presented this at a Wollongong Australian Radiation Protection Society conference, and I said, this is a terrible review. You should pull this report off the shelf. It's bad. It's bad science. And you were supposed to be setting the levels. So what do you think they did? They said, oh no, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. And we said, no, there's everything wrong with it. You should put it in the trash can. That's where it needs to go. Anyway, we keep arguing about that, but we're actually going to write a scientific paper. We're going to embarrass them even further. Next slide. So when you look at human studies, these are animal studies where human beings are actually irradiated, and you can't do what you can do with animal studies. You can't irradiate a human being and then sacrifice him and look at the changes in the organs and body fluids. So we've got to work around. We've got to work around it. And 51 effect studies. Basically, what we do is sample blood and saliva and skin and sperm, and we look for changes. And we've got 51 effect studies, 10 no effect studies. And you can see there on the right-hand side, we've got DNA damage, biochemical changes, altered enzyme cases. There's only a small number of human studies, very few, because we've got to work on what we can get from human beings, which is urine or faeces or blood or saliva. So there's some evidence there that there's bioeffects. Next slide. So here we go. These are the animal studies. Okay, mainly rats and mice. And when you look at the animal studies, the group 1 up there, you see there's 366 effect studies and 85 no effect studies. And so but then you look at the left-hand side and you see most of these studies are short-term studies. They're not long-term studies. We've only got, as you go down, you find that the long-term, there's only a few handful of long-term studies. And what do you find? What changes do you find? You find biochemical changes, altered enzyme activity, oxidative stress, all these biochemical, you know, all these biological markers. And particularly when you get to the longer-term studies, you find that DNA starts to move up in the ranking. DNA damage. So if you go, we'll go to the next slide. Thanks. Yeah, so, sorry, it's getting a bit dry. So when you go to, when you look at the animal studies, now, these are studies, as I said before, the actual current levels are set on the basis of thermal heating. So we have what are called non-thermal exposures. So when we isolate all those exposures that are to do at much lower levels, we actually find all these effects. We find 207 papers that actually show at these lower exposure levels actually show effect and no effect. And there's a little wedge up there with 9 effect positive studies, and that means that the researcher has actually said, maybe there's some benefit in a little bit of irradiation that probably triggers the immune system, and maybe there's some benefit in this. Well, we've always known this. We've always known at these lower levels that it can be used for also for therapy as well. So that's not something all that new. In fact, we've used RF for bone healing, and Dr. Cooper there can talk more about that. But there's always been some small benefit that may result. So there is a small wedge there, but overwhelmingly, most of these studies show that there's a detriment rather than benefit. Next slide. And the other thing we can do with the ORSAA database is we can pull out, we can look at the studies, particularly the animal studies, which use real mobile phone signals and those that are simulated. When they do these studies, They use real mobile phones to irradiate the animals, or they use simulated signals. And when you look at that, you'll see there the first line, 120 effect studies and 18 no effect studies. Well, that's pretty convincing that these mobile phone signals are pretty bioactive. And when you look at the simulated phone signals, you see that it's not so clear. So real mobile phone signals are a lot more bioactive. That's what I'm saying. Next one. These are all the in the ORSAA database. We can do a summary of all the biological effects, and there's a whole heap of them there. Next slide. When we look at mobile phone towers, well, how many experiments do we really have? How many epidemiological studies do we really have? Well, there's only, this is worldwide, there's only 29. And you can see there that overwhelmingly there's a lot more effect studies than no effect studies. And the other thing, the 4 no effect studies, I just want you to note there that it's those studies were done by the German government and the UK Telecom. So, and I'll tell you more about that as we go through the slides. So there's not many studies. If you move down, next slide, and you can see there that in Australia there's not a single study in Australia that has been carried out on mobile phone base stations, right? So not a single one, right? Not one. And the only one that actually, the study that was carried out, I don't know if you remember, there used to be a tower in Willoughby, a TV tower. Well, they actually did some research. They looked at the childhood leukemia in the surrounding areas, and they'd look at all the population within 500 metres, 1,000 metres. These are TV antennas. These signals are all bioelectric. They're all bioactive. And when the person who did that study was Dr. Bruce Hocking, who was Chief Medical Officer for Telstra. Well, he wasn't very popular with Telstra, and he was basically shown the door eventually. But if you have a look at that, but that's not RF. That's very high frequencies, they're TV frequencies. And there's a few others. But if you look at the last one, this is really interesting, because the US Embassy in Moscow, the Russians decided to irradiate the US Embassy in Moscow. Now, I don't know how it came that the US found out that they were actually being radiated by RF radiation, but it went on for a number of years, between 1953 and 1978. So the Russians were actually, maybe they were trying to stop them transmitting radio transmitting signals from the actual their embassy, and that's why they were doing it. But the levels in which they were actually exposing them to were that limit, limit of that's based on heating is right up here, and they were exposing them to about 3%. It was much lower levels. And the frequencies they were using, they actually engaged this Linnefield to go back and interview all the previous staff and to find out whether they had any health issues. And what did they find? They were radiated for 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for something like 2 to 4 years. These people were radiated, the staff, and they went back and they found that the symptoms were eczema and psoriasis, the skin problems, and allergy and inflammation reactions. So that was actually quite interesting, quite interesting observation that was made. And in particular, the skin one, the fact that skin conditions were actually highlighted, because with the higher frequencies, with the new 5G, with the higher frequencies, actually the radiation is going to be attenuated in the skin mainly. So, and of course, the skin is a very large organ. If you go to the next slide, thanks. Yeah, because of the ORSAA database, we actually, when we put the paper in there, we actually look to see who's funded the research. And when you do that, you find that if it's institutionally funded only, that is the universities are actually sponsoring the research, you find a lot more effect studies than no effect studies. But when industry is funding the research, actually the situation gets reversed. So there's the information's being distorted. The research is being distorted by the money. Who's funding the research? If you go to the next slide, we also, in the ORSAA database, we actually take note of what country the primary researcher is actually doing the work. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the countries like China, their researchers published 141 effect papers and 13 no effect papers. So the Chinese researchers are finding a lot more effect papers and no effect papers. And the countries on the left there, you can see Sweden 66 to 13 and Russia 40 to 20. And as soon as you move across, waiting question time, I think. As soon as you move across to those countries like DEU is Germany, you find there's more. They produce a lot more no effect papers than effect papers, and Great Britain 34 to 22. And remember, I said those 4 mobile phone base station papers were actually being produced in Germany and also in the UK, and it's not a surprise, really. And you've got to think Finland, for example, small country, but it's got Nokia, you know. There's a bit of industry protection happening there. And the interesting thing about all this is that the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians are actually listening to their researchers, and they've set a level. Currently, as I said, the IGNIT level is set up here, and they've set a level 100 times lower. So they're listening to their researchers, and they've decided to go for a much lower level. Next slide. Oh yeah, just is any of this new? Well, no. You know, all this mobile phone, all this has come from the military. It's basically a military invention. And of course, the military knew about this back in 1976, so none of this is actually new. It's being obscured somewhat. And you can see there that the military noticed in their military personnel that were exposed to RF radiation that they got headaches, fatigue, they got dizzy, disorders, irritability, depression. You know, all the things that we're seeing in population groups, are being seen here. So next slide. So identify risks. Well, yeah, we can identify the risks. Brain cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurodegenerative. There's a whole stack of risks. So if you go down, the next slide, chronic diseases. Well, the top health burdens, and Dr. Russell Cooper will speak more about this, is cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, etc. And, I asked the question, is EMR actually playing a role in this? Because the actual background level of EMR that was here on this planet before all this stuff came is anywhere between 1 billion and one with 18 zeros after it, or 1 with 9 zeros, so somewhere in between there, depending on where you are on this planet. We have increased the background at least 1 billion-fold with this technology. And you've got to ask the question, is that having an effect on population? In particular, our children, they'll have a lifetime of this. I'm an old person, I won't be around for the next 20 years from now, I'll be gone. But you've got to remember, our children are actually growing up with this their whole life. And it's cranking up all the time, and there seems to be no restriction. We're all part of a huge biological experiment here, because, as I said, the long-term effects, we just don't have that evidence. And if you go to the next slide, so what I'm saying to you is converging evidence on health effects are these levels that are much lower than the current thermal level which is set. But basically they have a license to do whatever they want, because they're never going to exceed this thermal level, the level inside the microwave. It's never going to be exceeded, this heating level. But we're seeing evidence of biological effects at much lower levels, what we call non-thermal levels, which is very troubling. And they're real. They're not figments of our imagination. The telecom people, I went to a conference down in Melbourne, and the telecommunications people said, oh, there's no evidence. There's no evidence no health evidence. Oh, all these bioeffects, they don't really add up to anything. There's no real health evidence here. There's not a problem, you know. We'll just keep motoring it out. And so I ask you, is there enough smoke to say we've probably got a fire happening? And and the other thing too is that we need stronger consumer advice, particularly around children. We need to be, they're going to have a lifetime of this exposure, and we need, and of course, they don't even, and a lot of these studies, they're not even considered, you know, as I said, the interphone study, and considered. I mean, the interphone study is 2000, 2004, it's an old study. You know, the number of, you know, it's tools of the trade these days. You know, mobile phones are tools of the trade. You know, we should be telling people that not to plug it up to their ear, you know. And how many people know that the manufacturer says you've got to have a gap, an air gap between the phone and your ear? You know, we should be really starting to give that advice out. I'll just leave you with the final. What we've been plugging for is for the precautionary approach to be adopted. And what I'd like to leave with you is that we believe the trigger point has been reached, and the precautionary approach needs to be applied to this technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Well, I'll hand the mic back to Victor to take questions while Dr. Cooper gets set up. Are you aware that the telcos cannot get insurance for harm caused by mobile phones in the towers? That's how risky this is.
Okay. I think there was a lady over there who wanted to ask a question. She put her hand up.
Can we get people to come down to the front and use the microphone?
Oh, sorry?
So we can hear it. Can we get people to come to the front?
Do you want me to come over here?
No, there's a microphone.
Okay, I've got that. Okay. Yeah, it's on now. Okay, yeah.
It's not loud.
Most of the information is about 3G phones, not about 4G phones.
No, it's
can you just ask, sorry, can you ask that question again so we can get you on?
You were talking about the effects from mobile phones. Is all the information that we've gathered over the years is just about 2G and 3G, not 4G phones? And is it true that 4G phones, there's not much information yet still coming out, and is it true that they're 4 times more powerful than 3G phones?
The interesting thing about, there is a lot of studies done on 4G phones, but the change in technology has meant the modulation patterns are a little bit different. And it's those modulation patterns that are more bioactive. The other thing too, and I didn't mention this, is that wireless phones in your home, the one where you pull it out from the base station and you walk around, they're actually basically a mobile phone because they're using the same sorts of frequencies and the modulation patterns are very similar. So, there are quite a lot of studies on 4G phones and they're a lot more bioactive. The other thing I should say too is that when they do these studies, they look at the cumulative number of hours used. Now, that actually isn't such a good indicator of exposure because here in the country, where your mobile phone signal is weaker, the actual mobile phone cranks up, the power goes up to get connection. I don't know if you've ever experienced, you put your mobile phone in a glove box and you're driving through the country and you pick it up and the battery's flat. And you think, I haven't used it, what's going on? Because it's spending all its time at high power trying to connect to the mobile phone tower as you're driving along, so the battery goes flat. And so people in the city where they've got good signal strength, their exposure, say for a 10-minute phone call, is actually going to be lower. Now, even with all those sorts of problems with doing epidemiological studies, it still shows evidence that for heavy users, and I say heavy users, and there's been other studies, a CERNET study has also followed on from the Interphone study, and a heavy user, 50 minutes a day with a mobile phone glued to his ear, I think there's be a lot more people in that category now. So they come up, the latency period is the thing, where you need a number of years before these statistics start to show up. But all the evidence is that, yep, mobile phones are a problem.
We'll take one more question and then. During the break, which will be at 6:30, where there's tea and coffee and soup, you're welcome to find the speakers and ask more questions.
Okay.
Yep. Brief question. You mentioned the 3,100 papers that you've got cited somewhere.
Yep.
Are they available as PDFs? And I also did a similar thing, gathering up papers on in my area of wildlife. And I found there's very, very few, barely any studies in classes, scientific, on the effects on wildlife of both EMR and radio frequency phones. We were doing wildlife surveys and using UNIBAT, ultra-high frequency detection units for working out bats, presence or absence in development areas, and where there were towers or high voltage power lines, there's less activity of bats, and strongly suggesting that there's some kind of effect on wildlife that's unmeasured, but certainly it's very suspicious. In other words, the bats are just not there or in very low numbers. And so that's what I'm particularly interested in, what studies have been done on the effects of wildlife. I think it's possibly a very serious issue for wildlife.
Yeah, I think you're dead right there. There's certainly been quite a few studies on bees where they put mobile phones in the beehive, and the bees haven't returned to the hive. They certainly it causes navigational problems. Where there's mobile phone tower been put near a beehive, there's quite a few studies on that. I might get your name, and I can actually send you some stuff here. But we've done studies on plants as well as insects. It is a problem to the wildlife. We're filling up the environment with all this environmental radiation and not really considering what it's actually doing to other animals, and insects in particular. Yep.
I've been living up on Mount Nardi, which hosts a mothership of towers that has been there forever.
Yep.
And I'm about a kilometre away from the towers. But interesting enough, when they introduced 3G towers to Mount Nardi, about 30% of the wildlife disappeared.
Yeah.
And that was in 2009.
Yeah.
But when they stuck a 4G tower up in 2013-14, 60% of the wildlife disappeared.
Okay, yeah.
That's the big difference.
Yeah, the modulation.
But understanding that Mount Nardi is a mothership and it does connect to all the other towers. It's the most powerful installation in the district.
Yeah, well, there are limited. Again, nobody's really doing a lot of research. There's sort of limited research in that area. Great. Yeah.